The Wild West was an era full of colorful characters and dramatic events. Each person or event in the Wild West tells a different story about the challenges and adventures of life in that time. So, from legendary sharpshooters to fearless journalists, here are some moments and figures that shaped history. Annie Oakley was born in 1860. Her real name was Phoebe Ann Moss. At the age of 15, she discovered her amazing skill with a gun. Tombstone, Arizona was founded in 1879. The town became famous for its lawmen and outlaws. One of the most legendary events in Tombstone was the shootout at the OK Corral. This gunfight happened between lawmen and a group of outlaws. The fight lasted only about 30 seconds, but it became one of the most famous moments in Wild West history. Tombstone represents the constant battle between law and crime.
I need a man with a good gun and a straight spine.
Bass Reeves was born a slave in 1838, but he later became one of the first black U.S. Marshals west of the Mississippi River. During his time as a marshal, he made more than 3,000 arrests. He killed 14 outlaws, but only in self-defense. Reeves always tried to bring criminals in alive where possible. Billy the Kid was born Henry McCarty in 1859. He left New York City to seek a new life in the West. Billy had many run-ins with the law. He became a well-known outlaw after joining the Lincoln County Regulators, a group trying to bring justice to a murder case. Billy the Kid became famous for reportedly killing 27 men, though the real number is likely lower. He was eventually killed in 1881 at the age of 21. His short life was full of violence and rebellion. Jesse James was born in 1847 in Missouri. At 17, he fought as a Confederate guerrilla during the Civil War. After the war, he formed a gang of outlaws. Belle Starr was born in 1848. She became known as the Bandit Queen. Belle was an outlaw who often found herself in trouble with the law. She was arrested by Deputy U.S. Marshal Charles Barnhill in 1886. The construction of the railroad was a major event in the Wild West. A photograph from 1868 shows a railroad bridge being built in the Green River Valley in Wyoming. The railroad brought progress, but it also brought challenges. It connected distant parts of the country, making travel easier, but it also led to conflict with native tribes and changed the landscape of the West forever. The railroad was both a symbol of progress and a cause of struggle. Laura Bullion was a member of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch gang. She was involved in the Great Northern Train robbery. In 1893, her mugshot was taken by Pinkerton's detective agency. Laura's life shows that women were not just bystanders in the Wild West. They took part in the same dangerous activities as men. The U.S. Army played a major role in the conflict between native tribes and settlers. One of the most tragic events was the slaughter of bison. In the 1870s, bison were hunted nearly to extinction. The U.S. Army encouraged this because they believed it would weaken the native tribes. The tribes depended on the bison for food and their way of life. By the end of the 19th century, only about 300 bison remained. In the Wild West, cowboys played an important role in driving cattle across the plains. But many people do not know that as many as 1 in 4 cowboys were black. After the Civil War, being a cowboy was one of the few jobs available to freed slaves. Many black cowboys headed west to escape the prejudices of the East. They found more freedom, but life was still tough. Calamity Jane was born Martha Jane Canary in 1852. She became famous for her adventurous life as a frontierswoman and scout. She was known for her bravery, but also her wild personality. Calamity Jane had many encounters with native tribes and was even rumored to have been married to Wild Bill Hickok. Her story is one of courage and independence. She lived her life on her own terms, even though it was a difficult and dangerous time for women in the Wild West. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 led to a rush of people seeking fortune. But by 1881, many had turned to other forms of mining. Silver became the new focus. In the town of Calico, California, silver mining became a major industry. But when the price of silver dropped, the town was abandoned by 1907. The gold rush and later the silver rush brought both hope and hardship to those seeking a better life. Some found riches, but most only found disappointment. Chief John Smith, also known as Kabi-Nagwi-Wens, was a member of the Chippewa tribe. He lived to be one of the oldest Native Americans on record, dying in 1922. Though some say he was as old as 138, he was likely under 100 when he died. Still imagine 50,000 people racing for a piece of untouched land. What shocking twists did some settlers resort to? Covered wagons were a common sight in the Wild West. Settlers used them to carry their belongings as they moved west in search of land. Life was not easy for these settlers. The Apache leader, Geronimo, fought against both the U.S. and Mexican armies. He was captured several times, but always managed to escape. His final surrender in 1886 made him a prisoner of war for the rest of his life. Geronimo used his fame to support himself by taking part in parades and photo shoots. The gold rush of 1848 changed California forever. Many people rushed to the state in the hopes of finding gold. One photo from 1851 shows a miner searching for gold. The gold rush brought people from all over the world, but only a few became rich. Butch Cassidy was one of the most famous outlaws in Wild West history. His mugshot was taken in 1849, but that was not the end of his life of crime. Butch Cassidy led a gang that robbed banks and trains. His story, like that of many outlaws, is a mix of crime and adventure. Butch Cassidy became a legendary figure, but his life was also full of danger and uncertainty. Chinese immigrants played a major role in building the railroads and developing industry in the West, but they faced racism and hostility from white settlers. Laws were passed to prevent more Chinese immigrants from coming to the U.S. The contribution of Chinese laborers is often overlooked, but without them, the growth of the West would have been much slower. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show was one of the most famous traveling shows of its time. It featured native performers like Iron White Man and Joe Black Fox, both members of the Sioux tribe. These shows were a mix of entertainment and propaganda. They portrayed the West as a place of constant conflict and adventure, but they often misrepresented the realities of native life. Performers like Iron White Man and Joe Black Fox used the show as a way to earn a living, but it also contributed to the stereotype of Native Americans as violent and untamed. Prostitution was a common part of life in the Wild West. Many women found themselves working in brothels because there were few other ways to earn a living. But in the freedom of the frontier, some women were able to rise to positions of power. They became owners of their own brothels and earned significant wealth. This shows that while life was tough for women in the Wild West, it also offered some the chance to gain independence and control over their own lives. Judge Roy Bean, known as the Law west of the Pecos, was one of the most eccentric figures in the Wild West. He held court in his saloon in southwest Texas and became known for his unusual rulings. While many stories portray him as a hanging judge, he only sentenced 2 men to death, and one of them escaped. The Oklahoma land rush of 1889 was a massive event in American history. On April 22nd, about 50,000 people rushed to claim their piece of 2 million acres of land that had been opened up by the U.S. government. Settlers could claim up to 160 acres of land for free, but they had to live on it and improve it. In 1897, James Collins, a 23-year-old tailor, was arrested for burglary in Omaha, Nebraska. His mugshot is a reminder that crime was common in the Wild West. With so many people seeking fortune and opportunity, the West became a place where the law was often hard to enforce. People like James Collins took advantage of the chaos to commit crimes, but many were caught and punished. Wyatt Earp is one of the most famous lawmen in Wild West history. He was born in 1848 and became a deputy marshal in Tombstone, Arizona. Earp is best known for his role in the gunfight at the OK Corral, where he and his brothers faced off against a group of outlaws. Wyatt Earp claimed to have killed more than a dozen outlaws during his career, but his life was also filled with controversy. He was accused of killing outlaws who were trying to surrender, but he was never charged. In his later years, Wyatt Earp tried his hand at several business ventures, including running a brothel. But it was his time as a lawman in Tombstone that made him famous. Wyatt Earp's legacy has been immortalized in countless books, movies, and television shows. He became a symbol of the tough, no-nonsense lawman who was willing to take matters into his own hands to bring justice to the West. Mining camps were a common sight in the Wild West, especially in areas rich in gold or silver. One photo from San Juan County, Colorado, shows a miners' camp set up along the side of a mountain. These camps were often temporary, set up by prospectors hoping to strike it rich. Life in the camps was hard, with harsh weather and poor living conditions. But for many, the hope of finding gold or silver made the hardships worth it. Next, there was once an 11-year-old boy named Jimmy McKinn. He was taken by a group of Apache people. This was not unusual for that time because conflict between settlers and native tribes often led to such incidents. The story of Jimmy's abduction is one of the many that highlight the tension and connection between these two groups. The boy was living with his family before this event. When he was taken, the Apache accepted him as one of their own. Another man, Bull Chief, was also deeply involved in the clash between settlers and native people. He belonged to the Absork tribe, also known as the Crow. As a warrior, Bull Chief led many raids against white settlers in the 1870s. These raids were part of the larger struggle between native tribes and the expanding United States. But as more settlers arrived, the native way of life was threatened. Bull Chief's tribe was eventually forced to move to a reservation where their freedom was limited. In another part of the West, a Navajo man participated in traditional ceremonies. These ceremonies were an important part of life for the Navajo people. They helped to maintain their connection to the spiritual world and their ancestors. The man wore ceremonial clothing, including a mask and body paint. This was not just for show, it had deep meaning for him and his community. These ceremonies helped to keep the Navajo traditions alive, even as their way of life was being threatened by the arrival of settlers. And with that, we are already halfway through the list. And if you're enjoying this video so far, then don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more such content. Olive Ann Oatman had a very different experience. She was taken captive by a native tribe in 1851. At that time, Arizona was a wild and dangerous place for settlers. Olive's family was attacked, and she was taken by a tribe. The tribe later sold her to the Mojave people. She lived with them for 5 years. During that time, they tattooed her face with blue markings. This was a common practice for the Mojave and had special meaning for them. Meanwhile, across the West, Chinese workers were helping to build the railroads. They were initially hired for manual labor, but soon proved themselves to be skilled workers. The Chinese immigrants worked as track layers, masons, and even foremen. Their hard work helped to build the railroads that connected the country, making travel and trade much easier. But their success did not come without challenges. The arrival of so many Chinese workers led to one of the most infamous anti-immigrant backlashes in U.S. history. Many people felt threatened by the presence of the Chinese, and laws were passed to limit their rights. The gold rush in California brought thousands of people to the West, all hoping to strike it rich. San Francisco was one of the main hubs for these prospectors. The city grew rapidly during this time, with people from all over the world arriving to try their luck. But not everyone who came to San Francisco found gold. Many found only hardship and disappointment. The gold rush helped to shape the history of the West, bringing people together from different backgrounds and creating a new kind of society. In Arizona, trappers and hunters were also trying to make a living in the wilderness. The land was harsh, but it was full of opportunities for those who knew how to survive. These men were part of the rugged, independent spirit that came to define the American West. They lived off the land and relied on their skills to survive. But like the settlers and native tribes, they too had to adapt to the changes brought by the arrival of more people. Not everyone in the West was involved in the fight for land or resources. Some people, like Goldie Williams, lived on the edges of society. Goldie was arrested for vagrancy in Omaha, Nebraska in 1898. Her story is a reminder that the West was not just about cowboys and gold miners. It was also a place where people struggled to survive, sometimes in ways that were less glamorous. That place was also home to performances that celebrated the myth of the frontier. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show was one of the most famous. It featured native performers like Whirling Hawk and Whirling Horse, who showed off their skills in front of the people.
Got any sense left, you just head on home.
You, sir, will die!
One of the most famous figures of the West was James Butler Hickok, known as Wild Bill. He was a soldier, lawman, gunslinger, and performer. His legend was largely created by himself, but there is no doubt that he was involved in many gunfights. Wild Bill's story is part of the larger myth of the West. He became a symbol of the rugged, independent spirit that many people associate with that time period. But behind the myth, there was a real man who lived a dangerous and often violent life. Wild Bill's story, like many others from the West, is a mix of truth and legend. His life shows how the West became a place of myth and storytelling, where lines between reality and fiction were often blurred. The West was also a place of saloons and hotels, like the Table Bluff Hotel in Humboldt County, California. These places were gathering spots for people who lived in the West, offering a place to rest and relax. But they were also places where deals were made and plans were hatched. Dodge City, Kansas was one of the most famous towns of the West. It was a major terminal for cattle drivers, which brought young cowboys with guns into the town. Dodge City became known for its lawlessness, but it also had lawmen who had tried to keep the peace. The clash between the cowboys and the lawmen helped to create the image of the Wild West as a place of danger and excitement. The story of John Heath, who was lynched in Tombstone, Arizona in 1884, is another example of the rough justice of the West. Heath was involved in a robbery that went wrong, resulting in a massacre. With little formal law in place, the people of Tombstone took matters into their own hands and hanged him. This kind of vigilante justice was common in the West, where the law was often slow to act. One of the most famous figures of the West was William Buffalo Bill Cody. He was a performer and showman who had helped to create the myth of the Wild West. His shows featured native performers and recreated famous battles from the frontier. Buffalo Bill became a symbol of the West, but his real-life adventures were often exaggerated for the sake of entertainment. When Buffalo Bill died in 1917, he was laid to rest in Golden, Colorado. People came from all over to pay their respects to the man who had helped create the legend of the West. One of Harry Houdini's most iconic acts involved a trick known as the Chinese water torture cell. In this act, he would be suspended upside down by his ankles. Then his head and body would be lowered into a tank filled with water. Helen Keller's story is one of the most inspiring tales in history. At just 19 years old, she became blind and deaf after an illness. For many, this would have been a devastating setback. But Helen Keller was not one to give up. Her parents sought out experts who could help her, and they eventually found Anne Sullivan, a teacher who would change Helen's life forever. In 1965, John Lewis led a group of marchers across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. The group was attacked by state troopers, but the images of that day shocked the nation. After gaining her freedom, Sojourner Truth became a powerful voice for abolition and women's rights. She traveled across the country, giving speeches and educating people about the evils of slavery and the importance of equality. One of her most famous speeches was titled, "Ain't I a Woman?" In this speech, she spoke about the injustices that women, particularly black women, faced in society. Another figure known for living a bold life was Wild Bill Hickok. Born in 1837, Hickok was a legendary figure of the American Wild West. One of the most well-known tales involves a poker game in Deadwood, South Dakota, where Hickok was holding a two-pair hand of black aces and black eights when he was shot and killed. This hand has since become known as the Dead Man's Hand. Amelia Earhart flew a plane for the first time in 1920. This was a life-changing event for her because she decided right then that she wanted to fly. She quickly took lessons and became the most famous female pilot of her time. By 1922, Earhart became the first woman to fly over 14,000 feet. In 1932, she became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. Her achievements paved the way for women in aviation. Unfortunately, this passion for flying would also lead to her disappearance in 1937. She vanished over the Pacific while trying to fly around the world. The search for her has sparked many theories, but her plane was never found. Audrey Hepburn became a Hollywood sensation after her role in Roman Holiday. People were amazed by her beauty and charm, and she became a style icon. But she wasn't only about glamour. Hepburn worked for UNICEF and dedicated her time to helping children in need. She spent her final years focusing on charitable work, which she said was her way of making the most of her remaining time. Calamity Jane was a tough figure from the Wild West. Her real name was Martha Jane Canary, but people knew her as Calamity Jane. She could ride, shoot, and drink with the best of them. How she got her name is debated, but one story says she saved a man's life and earned her title. George Washington Carver was born into slavery, but he rose to become a famous scientist and inventor. He had a deep love for plants, and as a child, local farmers called him a plant doctor because of his knowledge. Even though he faced racial discrimination and was turned away from schools, he continued to pursue his education. Carver eventually helped farmers in the South by promoting peanuts as a crop. He created more than 300 uses for the peanut and became a symbol of innovation in agriculture. Harriet Tubman was born into slavery, but escaped in 1849. She didn't stop there, though. Tubman became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, helping dozens of other slaves find their freedom. She was brave and determined, returning to the South many times to lead others to safety. Tubman's courage was celebrated, and she is remembered as one of the most important figures in the fight against slavery. Joseph Stalin rose to power in the Soviet Union in the early 20th century. Before his political career, he studied to become a priest. But his life took a sharp turn when he discovered the writings of Karl Marx and became involved in the revolution. He became the leader of the Soviet Union after Vladimir Lenin's death and ruled with an iron fist. Joseph Goebbels was Adolf Hitler's Minister of Propaganda during World War II. He was one of the most feared men in the Nazi Party. Goebbels was known for his intense hatred, which a famous photo of him captures. When he found out that a photographer was Jewish, his polite demeanor changed to one of pure anger. Goebbels helped spread the Nazi message through film, radio, and speeches, and his work contributed to the horrors of the Holocaust. Karl Marx published the Communist Manifesto in 1848, and his ideas shaped much of the political landscape in the 20th century. He believed that capitalism would be replaced by socialism and eventually communism. Marx's work became the foundation for revolutions across the world, including the Russian Revolution of 1917. Though Marx himself died in 1883, his ideas continued to influence political movements for generations. But what about the shocking twist in the life of Mahatma Gandhi? A revelation that literally changed everything. King George V was not supposed to be king. He was born the second son of the royal family, but when his older brother died, George found himself next in line for the throne. He became king in 1910 and led Britain through World War I. To distance himself from his German roots during the war, he changed the royal family's name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor. Queen Elizabeth II is the longest-serving monarch in British history. She became queen at the young age of 25 after the death of her father, King George VI. Her reign has seen significant changes in the world, but she remained a steady and consistent figure. Her Platinum Jubilee celebrated her 70 years on the throne, marking a reign full of achievements, challenges, and service to her country. Butch Cassidy was a notorious outlaw in the Wild West. Along with his gang, the Wild Bunch, he robbed banks and trains across the West. Cassidy eventually fled to South America to avoid capture, and it is believed that he died in a shootout with the Bolivian army. His life as an outlaw has been romanticized in books and movies, but his criminal activities were far from glamorous. Elizabeth Taylor was a famous actress and one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. Her beauty and talent made her a household name. Taylor starred in many classic films, including Cleopatra and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, but her personal life, including her many marriages, was just as famous as her career.
Frederick Douglass, born a slave.
Frederick Douglass was born into slavery, but escaped to become one of the most influential abolitionists in American history. His speeches and writings inspired many to join the fight against slavery. Douglass's autobiography, published in 1845, detailed his life as a slave and his escape to freedom. Frida Kahlo was a Mexican artist known for her unique and bold self-portraits. Her work often explored themes of identity, pain, and self-expression. Kahlo's life was filled with physical pain from a bus accident, but she channeled her suffering into art. George Armstrong Custer was a Union general during the American Civil War who became infamous for his death at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Ida B. Wells was a journalist and activist who fought against the horrors of lynching in the United States. Her writing exposed the truth about racial violence, and she faced many threats because of her work. Wells was one of the founders of the NAACP, and her fearless advocacy for justice continues to inspire those fighting for civil rights today. Jesse James was a Confederate guerrilla turned outlaw who terrorized the American Midwest. His crimes were often romanticized by the press, but he was far from a hero. James' life ended when he was betrayed and shot by a member of his own gang. Langston Hughes was a poet and writer who became one of the leading voices of the Harlem Renaissance. His work explored the experiences of Black Americans and often carried a strong political message. Mahatma Gandhi led India's struggle for independence from British rule through non-violent resistance. His philosophy of satyagraha inspired movements for civil rights and freedom across the world. Gandhi's leadership led to India gaining independence in 1947, but he was assassinated the following year. Mark Twain was an American writer best known for his novels The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Twain's wit and humor made him a beloved figure, and his works remain some of the most celebrated in American literature. Nellie Bly was a journalist who made headlines for her investigative reporting. She went undercover in a mental institution to expose the terrible conditions there, leading to major reforms. Bly also set a world record for traveling around the world in just 72 days. But if you think this is the only secret photos we've got, then make sure to check out this video at your right-hand side.